Hello everyone, tonight we're stepping straight into one of the most uncomfortable, absurd, and frankly miserable chapters of human history. What it meant to try and sleep through the Ice Age without fire. Picture it. No warm glow, no smoke curling into the night, no circle of light to push back the void. Just you, lying in the dark, wrapped in animal hides that smell like wet dog, while the wind sneaks in and freezes your bones. It wasn't noble. It wasn't romantic. It was teeth rattling, toes dying, and stomachs growling. From gnawing on frozen meat so tough it turned jaws into tools, to waking up with ears or fingers gone black from frostbite, to lying awake all night imagining predators just outside the hut. You can see why our ancestors prayed harder for embers than for gods. And yes, sometimes the gods answered, and sometimes they didn't. The Ice Age stripped survival down to its bare terms. Fire meant life. Without it, you weren't just cold, you were food. You were a shivering, sleepless, half-starved animal, hoping the night passed without claws, hunger, or despair finishing you off. And here's the strange part. You're alive today because your ancestors learned to keep that flame burning. Everyone else, the ones who didn't, the cold erased them. Take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually find these bleak bedtime stories oddly soothing. No pressure. I promise the Ice Age won't hunt you down if you skip it. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is on your side of the world. I imagine these words reaching different places like little sparks. Your screen here, someone's headphones on the other side of the planet there. It's a modern fire circle, in a way. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe put on a blanket, sip something warm, or let the background hum of a fan stand in for the wind outside an Ice Age cave. Tonight we'll walk into the endless cold together, one breath at a time, and see why sleep without fire was less a rest, and more a nightly battle for survival. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine this, not some office dweller with a half-broken radiator and a blanket shaped like a burrito, but a human born into the last Ice Age, a creature of skin, bone, and perpetual shivering. Forget central heating. Forget even the pathetic glow of a bedside lamp. Your life's main feature is cold bone, deep, marrow-gnawing, breath-freezing cold. The kind that doesn't politely knock, but barges through every layer of hide you drape over your back. And the worst part, it never lets up. Not at night, not at dawn, not even when the sun bothers to crawl across the sky like a tired torchlight. You would have gone to sleep every evening wrapped in animal skins that smelled like their previous owners, desperately hoping body heat alone could do what fire usually did. Spoiler, it couldn't. Without flames licking the air, the temperature in your cave or hut dropped so low that your breath crystallized in front of your face. Imagine sharing your blanket with visible fog. Romantic if your partner didn't die of hypothermia halfway through the cuddle. Cold in the Ice Age wasn't some passing discomfort you shook off with tea. It was lethal. Every night was a coin toss between waking up groggy and waking up frozen. You'd tuck your feet into someone else's stomach, pile on every scrap of hide, and still feel your toes burn with that special frostbite sting. Nature's way of saying, good news, you'll keep your life. Bad news, you'll lose your pinky toe. And don't flatter yourself thinking, oh, but humans are resilient. Sure we are. But resilience doesn't mean comfort. It means survival while cursing every gust of wind. It means shivering so violently that you start to wonder if maybe this is exercise. It means going to bed hungry because the cold preserved the mammoth meat so well you couldn't chew it without fire, and then lying awake because starvation has the same effect as espresso. The irony is rich too. You were technically living during one of the planet's great warm periods of glaciation. That's right, this was the better part of the Ice Age. The good season, which is like someone telling you the cell you're in has a lovely view, as long as you ignore the chains. Night after night, your bones ached as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down, reminding you that without fire you were just another fragile mammal, who'd made the questionable choice of settling in places where saber-tooths thought you looked like a midnight snack. And you'd never really sleep. Not the way you do now, under your insulated duvet. Back then, Sleep meant slipping into a half-conscious trance, waking up at every snap of a twig, every icy draft. You'd drift for minutes, then jerk awake because your own body was screaming, "Hey, you might be dying, maybe pay attention." The cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It made you desperate, suspicious, and dull. People without warmth grew quiet, conserving energy not just in their muscles but in their words. Nights stretched on endlessly, and silence crept into your skull until you started to mistake it for death tapping at the door. The cold took more than fingers and toes. It stripped away joy, and still, you endured it, night after night, because what else was there to do? The fire was fickle. If the wood was wet, if the spark failed, if the embers died, then so did you, which meant sometimes you simply went without. You lay in the dark, gnashing your teeth, and telling yourself tomorrow you'd make it right if you lived long enough to see tomorrow. So there you are, teeth rattling like loose dice in a cup. And what's keeping you alive? Shelter or whatever passes for it. Don't imagine anything cozy. No log cabins, no thick woolen roofs, not even the damp misery of a medieval hut. Your options in the Ice Age were caves, rock overhangs, or huts slapped together with bones, wood, and hides. House was a very generous term. Pile of mammoth ribs covered in stinking leather is closer to the truth. Caves had one advantage: they existed already. They were dark, solid, and moderately windproof, but they were also damp, filled with echoes, and occasionally still occupied by bears who hadn't read the part of the lease that said you were moving in. Overhangs were slightly worse, just cliffs pretending to be generous, letting you cower beneath them like a stray dog in a thunderstorm. And huts were the real gamble. You stacked sticks, mud, or bones, then hoped they didn't collapse when the wind sneezed in your direction. The irony is, shelter without fire was often just another refrigerator. A cave without flames turned into a stone coffin that stored humans the same way it stored carcasses, cold, stiff, slowly spoiling. Without heat, the walls radiated chill until your skin prickled and your breath smoked. You weren't safe, you were preserved, and not in a flattering way. More in a future archaeologists will find you curled up like a freezer-burned chicken wing kind of way. And of course, everything was damp. Meltwater dripped, condensation pooled, hides collected moisture like sponges. Your bedding reeked of wet fur and mildew, and the colder it got, the more the dampness clung to you. There was no dry season inside a cave, only slightly less clammy and actively dripping. Imagine trying to sleep on a pile of skins that smelled like a wet dog that had been left out overnight, while simultaneously knowing that wetness was leaching heat out of your body like a thief. Shelters also came with noise. Every gust of wind moaned through cracks like a ghost chorus, and every shift of the hides above you sounded like claws scratching stone. Without fire, there was no comforting flicker, no hiss of burning wood, just silence, broken by drafts and dripping, until your brain convinced you that something saber-toothed hyena, or the icy gods themselves, was breathing right behind your ear. You'd huddled together, pressed against your clanmates in a pile of human insulation, which sounds intimate until you remember none of you had bathed in months. The stench alone could smother romance quicker than the cold. But still, body heat was the only furnace you had. In those fragile shelters, closeness wasn't affectionate, was survival. And yet, even the flimsiest hut meant one thing: you weren't outside. The wind carved through hides and flesh like a blade. Inside, at least, you had a few layers of bone, mud, and animal skin between you and the endless, star-sprinkled indifference of the Ice Age sky. Still, without fire, your shelter wasn't a home. It was a box delaying frostbite by a few hours. Which meant when you woke up you carried the same thought into every morning. This might be the night it finally kills us. And this is where the real danger crept in, not the hungry lion, not the jealous cousin with a sharp rock, but the cold itself. Hypothermia wasn't a freak accident in the Ice Age, it was the default setting. Every night without fire was essentially a slow-motion argument with death, and death usually won. Your body, bless it, only works within a very narrow temperature range, and once you start dropping, things get strange fast. First came the shivering, the kind that rattled your bones so hard it felt like your skeleton was trying to escape. At first you thought, well, at least I'm warming myself up. But then it didn't stop. The more you shook, the more your muscles burned energy, and the hungrier you became. And remember, you weren't dining on warm stews. You were gnawing half-frozen scraps of meat that tasted like disappointment. No fuel, no heat. You shook, you starved, you froze. Then came the mental tricks. Cold didn't just bite your fingers, it gnawed at your thoughts. Slowly, your brain turned fuzzy, and the simple act of staying awake started to feel optional. People without fire often slipped into that half-dream state where you think lying down in the snow is a brilliant idea. And they did lie down, quietly, sometimes even smiling, because hypothermia has that cruel little feature. It convinces you you're warm just before it kills you. Children went first. Their small bodies couldn't hold heat, no matter how many hides you wrapped them in. Elders followed, brittle bones losing the fight faster than younger ones. The tribe always knew the cold would steal its share every winter. Death by hypothermia wasn't dramatic, was silent, almost polite. People drifted off into that endless sleep, while others sat nearby, listening, unable to stop it. And the irony, you could be inches from survival. One spark, one flame, one pathetic stick of dry wood, and the whole story would change. But without it, you were just an animal in a freezer. Even caves couldn't save you, not when stone walls radiated chill like a punishment. Your body became a battlefield of blood flow, pulling warmth to the core, abandoning fingers, toes, and ears as acceptable losses. Frostbite was practically a fashion statement. Blackened digits, shriveled noses, the human equivalent of seasonal wear and tear. Hypothermia was the quiet reaper of the Ice Age. Predators left claw marks, starvation left ribs, but the cold left nothing, just stillness. And yet, people adapted in ways you probably wouldn't. They slept huddled like a pile of puppies, buried under hides, exchanging breaths in thick clouds of condensation. They learned to wake often, to keep moving, to never quite trust the seductive pull of sleep. But the truth remained. Every night, without fire, was gambling against your own body's limits. And when the odds were stacked that high, you didn't just worry about the cold. You worried about what came with it. Because cold never arrived alone, it dragged hunger behind it like a shadow. See, cold alone was brutal, but paired with hunger it became almost elegant in its cruelty. Without fire, you weren't just freezing, you were starving. And the Ice Age had a sick sense of humor. The colder it got, the more calories your body needed just to keep that faint ember of heat alive. You burned through food like a bonfire on damp wood, except there was no bonfire and not nearly enough food. Think about it. A mammoth steak could have been a feast if you had fire to soften it. But raw, frozen meat is little more than an exercise in jaw torture. Chewing through it was like gnawing on a block of granite with a faint aftertaste of iron. And raw food didn't give you the same calories cooked food did. Fire breaks things down, releases nutrients, makes digestion less of a wrestling match. Without it, you were consuming the bare minimum, while your body was screaming for double. Roots and tubers, same problem. Without heat, they stayed tough, fibrous, and largely indigestible. You could gnaw on them, sure, but the nutritional payoff was slim. Imagine risking frostbite to dig through frozen earth for what amounts to a prehistoric chewing toy. Cooking could have turned it into a survival food. Without it, it was just extra jaw pain. And hunger sharpened the cold into something unbearable. On an empty stomach, your shivers turned violent. Your body tried to light a fire. It didn't have the fuel for burning muscle when fat ran out. Malnutrition set in, and suddenly even small wounds healed slower. Infections lingered, and your odds against the cold shrank even further. At night, lying in your damp hide, you could feel hunger like a second layer of cold inside your bones. Every stomach growl was a reminder that you weren't just losing heat, you were running out of yourself. And your mind, already fogged by the freeze, began to play tricks. You'd dream of food, hallucinate banquets, chew air in your sleep. All while the reality was that your clan's supplies were as frozen as the river outside, useless without fire to thaw them. And the cruelest detail, even if you did eat raw meat, your body spent precious energy digesting it, which only made you colder. It was survival on credit, you borrowed warmth you couldn't repay. Every bite left you more exhausted, every swallow another little debt owed to a body already going bankrupt. So you endured nights of gnawing hunger, knowing that fire could have solved both problems at once, warmth and nourishment. Instead, without it, the two worked together like conspirators, turning every night into an endurance trial. And while you lay there, fighting the double edge of hunger and cold, Another fear kept you awake, the fact that you weren't the only creature looking for warmth in the dark. As if freezing and starving weren't enough, the night also belonged to teeth. Without fire, you didn't just shiver in the dark, you advertised yourself as dinner. Fire wasn't only about warmth. It was a glowing keep-out sign for every predator with a good nose and an empty stomach. Take that away, and suddenly you're lying in the dark, listening to the crunch of snow outside, wondering which set of eyes is staring back at you. Picture it, wolves circling silently, steam puffing from their nostrils as they track your scent. Cave lions, bigger than modern lions, and twice as confident, padding through the night. Hyenas with bone-crushing jaws, laughing at the idea of your flimsy mammoth hide hut. Even bears, yes, Ice Age bears the size of nightmares, who might wander into your cave just to see if the new tenants tasted better than the old ones. Without fire, your shelter didn't intimidate anyone. A pile of bones covered in hides wasn't security. It was a gift trap for whatever predator felt like tearing into it. And oh, the noises. The snap of a twig, the low rumble of a growl, the shuffle of paws on frozen ground. Every sound in the dark was magnified until your pulse drowned out your own thoughts. Firelight would have made them hesitate, pushed them back into the shadows. But without it, you were the shadows. Predators could see better than you, smell better than you, move faster than you, and all you could do was huddle, clutching a stone blade that looked pitiful against a lion's teeth, praying that the beasts decided your clan wasn't worth the effort tonight. And it wasn't just the real predators. Fear itself stalked you. The human imagination, sharpened by darkness, conjured threats even when none came. Every rustle of wind became a stalking paw. Every dripping cave echoed a snarl. You couldn't tell if the danger was outside or just in your head, and that uncertainty was its own kind of torment. Because the truth was simple. Sometimes it was in your head, and sometimes it was right outside, waiting. Night after night, without fire, you lived in a constant state of alertness. You never truly slept. You hovered on the edge, ears straining for the one sound that would mean running or dying. And when morning came and you were still alive, you didn't feel lucky. You felt exhausted, knowing the game would reset again once the sun fell. The irony. Fire didn't make you stronger. It just made you look untouchable. Without it, predators were the landlords, and you were just the squatter hoping rent wouldn't be collected in flesh. And while you sat there, clenching your teeth at every sound, another creeping discomfort was already setting in the smaller predators, the ones you couldn't scare off, even with flames. Because here's the sick joke of the Ice Age. Even in a world of glaciers and freezing winds, the bugs never left. You might think, too cold for mosquitoes. Right, wrong. Where there were people, there were pest lice, fleas, ticks, and every other tiny parasite that knew humans were just portable buffets wrapped in hide. Fires, smoke would have sent them packing. But without it, you were their midnight feast. Lice nested in your hair, in your hides, in the seams of your bedding. Fleas thrived in the damp animal skins you huddled under, leaping from body to body like overeager party guests. Ticks waited in the brush, crawling into the folds of clothing and biting down with a patience worthy of saints. And in the dark, while you tried to sleep, every itch magnified. You scratched until your skin broke, and that's when the real problem started: disease. Because those bites weren't just annoying, they carried an infection. Without fire to sterilize tools, to boil water, or even to smoke out pests, the smallest wound could fester. You got sores, fevers, rashes. Your body, already weakened by hunger and cold, had no defenses. A single flea bite could spiral into something that killed you just as surely as a lion. You didn't need an ambush. In the night, you could die from an insect the size of a sesame seed. And lice weren't just biting, they were colonizing. Entire populations thrived in your hair and clothes, and your clan passed them around like shared jewelry. Fire could have kept them at bay, but without it, you carried them everywhere. Imagine trying to rest with hundreds of creatures crawling on your skin, sucking your blood, while your body trembled with cold. Sleep became impossible, not just from fear of predators, but from the crawling itch of parasites. The irony is that bugs didn't freeze the way you did. They thrived in your warmth, your little oasis of heat in the cold wasteland. You were their fireplace. You became the fire. And when the clan huddled together, passing body heat, you passed fleas. It was a group survival strategy and a group infestation program rolled into one. And this wasn't just an inconvenience. It shaped survival. Insects spread disease through blood and filth, weakening entire clans. Without fire, you had no smoke to clear the air, no boiling water to purify, no way to keep bedding dry and clean. The bugs were patient killers, working slowly, invisibly, while you scratched at your sores and wondered why the gods seemed so cruel. So while you lay awake, listening for lions and feeling the cold seep in, another kind of predator was already feasting, smaller, quieter, but just as deadly. And if you managed to ignore the crawling itch long enough to drift into uneasy dreams, the next terror waiting for you wasn't even physical. It was the darkness itself. And then came the darkness, real darkness. Not the gentle city kind, where you can still see the glow of a billboard or your neighbor's porch light. No, Ice Age darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed on your eyes until you weren't sure if they were open or closed. Without fire, there was no flicker, no glow, no small promise that you could see danger before it saw you. You lay there swallowed whole by blackness, ears straining, mind inventing horrors where even silence felt loud. Nights stretched on forever. In winter, they could last 15 hours, long enough for your thoughts to unravel, for fear to bloom in every corner of your mind. Every sound was amplified, every absence of sound even worse. A snapping twig could send your heart hammering, but so could the endless quiet. Because sometimes silence meant predators had already found you and were circling without a noise. And without fire, you had no way to break the monotony. Darkness was time itself standing still. You couldn't stitch hides or carve tools. You couldn't even see your own hands. Conversations dwindled because every word felt like a risk, as if sound might summon something from the void. So you lay in silence, trying not to think, but thinking anyway. Is that breath behind me mine, or someone else's? Humans weren't built for pure blackness. Our eyes crave light, our brains panic when they don't get it. Without fire, your mind turned inward, filling the void with visions. You saw shapes moving where there were none, imagined spirits crouching in the corners of the cave. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe hunger, maybe your ancestors inventing gods out of sheer terror. But either way, darkness was never empty. It was crowded, and sleep. Forget it. Who could relax in a world where you couldn't see your own child's face next to you, let alone the lion at the cave's mouth? You dozed in fits, startled awake by your own heartbeat. Dreams merged with reality until you weren't sure if the shadow looming was in your mind or the entrance. And sometimes it was both. The cruelest detail, darkness made the cold worse. Without fire, there was no visual trick, no dancing light to distract you from the chill. The night became a single, endless reminder that you were fragile, small, and utterly alone. You weren't just freezing, you were dissolving into the black, becoming one more forgotten thing in a world that didn't care. And when the sun finally returned, weak and pale, you didn't feel rested. You felt wrung out, as if the darkness had drained you dry. And yet, you had to rise, gather, hunt, live, because, in a few hours, it would return again. Which meant you learned to fear not only the predators outside, but the ones inside, the gnawing doubts, the restless shadows, the little voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't make it through another night. But if you thought you'd catch up on rest once daylight came, think again, because the cold and dark had already taught your body a cruel trick. Sleep was never safe, never steady. By now, you've probably realized that sleep in the Ice Age wasn't the cozy, 8-hour recharge modern humans dream about. It was more like a series of nervous naps, interrupted by cold drafts, hunger pangs, and the occasional suspicion that a wolf was breathing just outside the hide flap. Sleep was fragile, a patchwork stitched together by instinct and fear. You'd drift off for a few minutes, maybe an hour if you were lucky, only to jolt awake because your body thought your dropping temperature meant death was inbound. Shivering wasn't just a symptom, it was a built-in alarm clock that refused to let you sink into real rest. Every time your muscles spasmed, your brain chimed in. Congratulations, you're alive. Barely. And back to half-conscious vigilance you went. Group sleeping made sense. Of course, huddling together under hides, pressed against clanmates, was the prehistoric version of central heating, but it didn't guarantee sleep. Someone always snored, someone always shifted, and someone always woke the entire group, whispering that they'd heard something. You learned quickly that something could mean anything from a saber-tooth to a dripping cave wall. Either way, everyone was awake again, listening, waiting, not daring to relax. And then there was the time problem. In winter, nights stretched endlessly, far longer than your body knew what to do with. Modern humans are wired to sleep in cycles 7-8 hours, maybe a nap if the boss isn't looking. But Ice Age nights demanded 15 hours of wakefulness in the dark, or 15 hours of fractured rest that never really counted. People probably adopted segmented sleep, drifting in and out, gathering warmth, waking to poke at imaginary threats, then nodding off again. It wasn't restful, it was survival on layaway. Dreams didn't help. Exhausted and half-starved, you hallucinated in your sleep, mixing reality with nightmare. Was that a hyena laughing outside, or your brain replaying the sound? You couldn't be sure, and so you'd wake, heart pounding, clawing at the hides around you. Your mind and body were trapped in a cycle of false alarms and real ones, and you never knew which was which until it was too late. And the cost, fatigue, became constant. Daylight didn't bring relief, it brought tasks. You rose groggy, bones aching, eyes gritty, expected to hunt, sow, gather, and walk miles across frozen ground. There was no chance to catch up on sleep, no leisurely morning in bed. Sleep debt wasn't an abstract concept, it was the permanent condition of your existence. The irony, of course, is that humans thrived in spite of it. You got by on scraps of rest, half dreams, shared body heat, and the sheer stubbornness to keep going. But don't think of it as resilience, Alon. Think of it as a body tricked into believing fractured survival counted as living. And just when you thought you'd adapted, another problem surfaced. Without fire, your nights were unproductive, your days overcrowded, and your tools and tasks fell behind. Because without firelight, the dark steals not only your rest, but also your time. And here's another little misery you probably didn't think about. Without fire, your nights weren't just cold and sleepless, they were wasted. Darkness makes you useless. Once the sun dipped, your ability to work shrank to zero. No sharpening spearheads, no stitching hides, no carving bone needles. Tasks piled up like snowdrifts because the hours after dusk were a void. The firelight, even the faint glow of embers, was a workshop. It turned night into time you could use. Without it, you fumbled in the dark, holding tools you couldn't see, cutting your fingers instead of shaping flint. Imagine trying to sew animal skins into a tunic with nothing but moonlight filtering through a cave entrance. You'd stab your palm 10 times before finishing a single seam, which meant repairs didn't get done. Tools broke faster, clothes stayed torn, and survival got riskier by the day. Stone tools dulled with use cutting meat, scraping hides, shaping wood. Without light to sharpen them, you carried blunt edges into the next hunt. A dull spear didn't just inconvenience you. It might mean the mammoth walked away while you froze and starved. Small inefficiencies multiplied until the entire clan dragged under their weight. And productivity wasn't the only loss. Rituals, teaching, and storytelling all happened around firelight. That glow wasn't just warmth, it was culture. Without it, nights turned silent, except for shivers and sighs. Knowledge transfer slowed. A child couldn't watch their elder carve a spearhead or etch marks into bone. Without fire, there was no classroom, no workshop, no shared focus, just darkness swallowing opportunity. Even maintenance of survival basics faltered. Hides left unrepaired, stiffened and cracked in the cold. Nets and ropes frayed, weapons splintered. Fire would have given you those extra hours to keep everything in working order. Without it, you woke to broken tools and broken hopes, scrambling to fix things under daylight that was already too short. And the cruel irony, predators didn't care if your spear was dull. Frost didn't care if your cloak had holes. Darkness stole your ability to prepare, and the world punished you anyway. You weren't just cold, you were constantly behind, living in a perpetual state of catch-up with nature. So, nights without fire weren't only about survival, they were about stagnation. You sat in silence, hands idle, mind restless, listening to the wind while your tools lay broken beside you. And in that silence, hunger grew sharper, fatigue heavier, and despair deeper. Because without fire, even the simplest act of fixing a spearhead could only wait until dawn. And dawn, in the Ice Age, never arrived with kindness. It brought cold, hunger, and work that your weakened body was already failing to meet. Which meant even eating the most basic human task turned into another impossible challenge. Now, here's the real insult. Even when you managed to kill something, let's say, After hours of trudging through snow, half-starved, half-frozen, and entirely miserable, you still couldn't get the full benefit of eating it without fire. Cooking isn't just a luxury, it's a biological upgrade. It breaks down tough fibers, unlocks nutrients, kills parasites. Without it, you were chewing harder, gaining less, and probably swallowing a side of bacteria for dessert. Take meat, for example. Raw, frozen flesh was the Ice Age equivalent of eating a leather boot. Sure, it had calories, but your body spent so much energy digesting it that you ended up colder, not warmer. You gnawed and tore until your jaw ached, swallowing chunks that sat in your gut like rocks. Fire could have turned that into a calorie-dense, easily absorbed meal. Instead, you were locked in a nightly arm-wrestling match with your own stomach. And plants, forget the idea of roasting roots or boiling grains into something nourishing. Raw tubers stayed fibrous and bitter, often laced with toxins that fire would have neutralized. You could eat them raw, yes, but eat here meant chew for 30 minutes, swallow, and then spend the night with stomach cramps. Fireless diets weren't just less satisfying, they were less safe. The parasite problem was worse. Raw meat carried worms and pathogens that thrived in the guts of Ice Age prey. Without cooking, you ingested them wholesale. Malnutrition wasn't always about lack of food, it was about food stealing from you. Parasites robbed you of what little energy you had, leaving you weaker, slower, and more vulnerable to the cold. Imagine dragging yourself through snow while also hosting a private zoo in your intestines. And fire wasn't just about digestion, it transformed food into medicine. Boiling water killed microbes you couldn't see. Heating herbs made them potent. Without those tricks, you drank straight from rivers that doubled as latrines for animals. And you ate medicine that probably poisoned you more than it cured. Survival without cooking wasn't resilience, it was roulette with your digestive system. The effects stacked over time. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems, stunted growth, and made recovery from injuries nearly impossible. Children grew slower, adults aged faster, and every infection hit harder. Cold, hunger, and malnutrition were a vicious triangle. You couldn't fix one without the others. And without fire, you couldn't fix any of them. And yet, night after night, you still tried. You gnawed, swallowed, endured, and convinced yourself it was enough. But deep down, your body knew you were running on fumes. And when hunger and malnutrition eroded strength, something else began to erode the bonds between you and the people pressed against your side in the dark. Because without fire, even the community began to unravel. Now, you'd think that freezing, starving, and scratching at fleas together would at least bring people closer. Shared suffering, shared survival, right? Wrong. Without fire, community didn't bloom, it withered. Fire was the glue, the hearth, the reason people sat in circles, told stories, made plans, and even remembered who they were. Without it, nights were just silence and suspicion, punctuated by the sound of your neighbor's teeth chattering. Firelight created conversation. It lit faces, softened fear, and gave everyone something to focus on besides their own misery. Without it, darkness pressed people into themselves. You couldn't see the expressions of those huddled around you, couldn't read their moods or intentions. Trust frayed in the dark. A whisper sounded like plotting. A cough sounded like doom. The absence of fire turned every group into strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, conserving heat while privately wondering who might not make it through the night. And let's not romanticize the communal cuddle. Sure, you were pressed together for warmth, but affection wasn't the driving force necessity was. You tolerated each other's stink, the fleas hopping body to body, the endless shifting of limbs, because the alternative was death. It wasn't intimacy, it was logistics. And nothing kills bonding faster than realizing your best friend's body heat is worth more to you than his personality. Fire was also a culture. Around flames, people painted with words, shared myths, passed down survival knowledge. In the dark, knowledge transfer slowed to a trickle. Children couldn't learn by watching elders carve tools or sew hides they couldn't see. Storytelling shrank into mutters, if it happened at all. Rituals faded. Laughter died. Nights without fire weren't communities, they were just clusters of bodies waiting for dawn. And paranoia thrived. In pitch black, you couldn't tell if your cousin was looking at you kindly or calculatingly. Every shuffle in the dark raised questions. Did someone move closer for warmth or to steal food? Did that whisper mean comfort or conspiracy? Fire kept such fears in check, because you could see. Without it, shadows turned people into mysteries, and mysteries are dangerous when survival depends on trust. So, instead of uniting, the cold carved little cracks in the clan. Silence, suspicion, and exhaustion did their work. Bonds loosened, the community shrank. The very thing that should have held you together nightfall became the thing that hollowed you out. And if the cold didn't take someone, loneliness just might. Because when fire disappeared, the world didn't just grow darker, so did you. And in that growing darkness, your body started showing the physical price of all those endless night's injuries that didn't heal. Limbs that went numb, frostbitten scars carved by the cold itself. So let's talk about the real trophies of an Ice Age night without fire. Frostbite and its charming cousin, permanent damage. If you'd been unlucky enough to sleep without flame, you wouldn't just wake up tired, you'd wake up less than you were when you went to sleep. Fingers, toes, ears, even the tip of your nose. The cold treated them like optional accessories. Survival meant watching parts of yourself turn black, shrivel, and sometimes fall off. It started subtle. A tingling in your toes, a numbness in your fingers. You'd think, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it'll pass. Spoiler, it didn't. The blood retreated to protect your core, abandoning your extremities like generals sacrificing soldiers for the greater good. First, the skin turned pale. Then it hardened, blistered, and went black, and the pain constant, gnawing fire where fire itself should have been. The damage didn't stop at appearances. Frostbite crippled your ability to live. Toes lost meant balance gone. Fingers lost meant tools dropped, weapons useless. Your survival toolkit was your body, and every night without fire chipped away at it. Imagine trying to sew hides with stumps instead of fingers, or trying to grip a spear when your hand no longer listened to you. Injuries weren't just scars, they were permanent demotions in the brutal game of staying alive. And it wasn't only frostbite. Cold air cracked skin until it bled. Lips split, heels split, knuckles split. Infection followed, crawling into those open wounds faster than you could lick them clean. Without fire to sterilize, you carried those infections like ticking clocks. Even a small cut could rot into something fatal, leaving you to die slowly of pus and fever while hyenas circled outside. The cruelest detail: children bore the brunt. Their small bodies lost heat fastest. Their fingers and toes froze first. Their survival odds plummeted quickest. Elders weren't far behind, their circulation already weak, their brittle bones no match for endless frost. You could measure the health of a group by its extremities. Frostbitten kids and elders meant the clan itself was failing. Fire could have saved them. Without it, the cold claimed them silently, one digit at a time. And here's the absurdity: you didn't even need to be outside. Inside your hut, wrapped in hides, surrounded by clanmates, frostbite still found you. Cold air seeped through cracks. Snow melted into dampness. Dampness froze against skin. It was like sleeping inside a refrigerator that actively wanted you dead. And when you woke to blackened fingertips, there was no doctor, no ointment, no miracle cure. There was only acceptance or amputation with a dull stone knife, a surgery performed with zero anesthetic and maximum screaming. The scars shaped behavior. You learned to tuck your hands inside your armpits while you slept, to curl into a ball, to press your bare feet into someone's belly for warmth, a romantic gesture that surely tested relationships. But no matter how many tricks you tried, the cold still carved its tax. You weren't just surviving the Ice Age, you were losing pieces of yourself to it, literally. And this had consequences for the whole group. Every lost hand meant fewer hides scraped. Every lost foot meant one less hunter in the snow. The cold didn't just cripple individuals, it crippled society. It left groups limping, short-handed, half-blind. Fire wasn't just convenience, it was the difference between keeping a workforce intact and watching it erode into disability. So you carried on, scarred, limping, missing bits of yourself, each injury a reminder of the night the fire died. And as you pressed forward, exhausted and diminished, there was always a deeper cruelty waiting, because if the cold didn't strip you, it would strip the weakest around you. And nothing cut colder than watching children fail to survive what you barely endured. If you thought frostbite was bad for adults, imagine being a child in the Ice Age without fire. To put it bluntly, children were the weakest links in a chain already rusting. Their little bodies lost heat faster. Their reserves of fat were smaller, and their ability to fight cold was practically non-existent. Fire wasn't just helpful for them, it was the line between life and almost guaranteed death. Think of an infant. Today, you wrap one in fleece, tuck them under blankets, maybe set up a space heater, and call it cozy. Back then, you wrapped them in animal skins that still smelled faintly of mammoth, and hoped your body heat was enough. But babies can't regulate their temperature. They go from pink to blue in minutes. One slip, one draft, one night without fire, and the clan could lose its youngest member before morning. And babies weren't the only ones. Toddlers and small children, with their thin arms and legs, burned through calories like torches. They needed more food per pound of body weight than adults, which meant, when the clan was hungry, they were the first to weaken. Malnutrition hit them hardest, and without the warmth of cooked food, their bodies never caught up. A child without fire grew slower, sicklier, and far more fragile. The mortality rates were staggering. Anthropologists estimate that in pre-modern societies, half of children died before the age of 5. Now place those statistics in an Ice Age camp without fire. Illness spread faster. Infections from bug bites or wounds went untreated. Parasites drained energy from already small bodies. And the cold itself, silent, patient, was relentless. One chill, one fever, one sleepless night was all it took. And don't forget the psychological weight. Parents carried the constant dread of losing children to something as simple as a dropped ember or a failed spark. Every night, they lay awake, not just shivering, but listening for the faintest cough, the stuttered breath, the silence that followed. And when a child slipped away, the grief didn't end with tears. It meant the clan's future was cut thinner, the lineage weaker, the next generation fewer. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. No, it was about producing enough children to outlast the odds. Without fire, that equation rarely balanced. The clan had tricks, of course. They bundled children in the center of sleeping piles, using adult bodies as insulation. Mothers tucked infants against bare skin under hides, creating living incubators. Older children were sent to gather moss or grasses for bedding, their tiny hands working until numb. But no matter the ingenuity, there were always losses. Every camp carried memories of the nights when cold took too much. And the cold carved its lessons in behavior. Adults became overprotective, obsessive about shelter, paranoid about drafts. They watched children not just with love, but with desperation, knowing each one represented survival itself. The birth of a child wasn't joy alone, it was another fragile candle in a storm, and one that could blow out at any moment without flame. So while you, as a modern listener, may think of children as the soft center of family life, in the Ice Age, they were fragile investments in a brutal lottery. Fire kept that investment alive. Without it, every night became a gamble, and more often than not, the house won. And when children were taken, the cold left something behind: fear. Fear that burrowed into adults, shaping their minds, making them anxious, restless, suspicious. Because the cold didn't just kill bodies, it rewired souls. And that psychological toll lingered long after the sun rose. Here's the part no one likes to admit. The cold didn't just gnaw at your body, it gnawed at your mind. Every night without fire wasn't just a physical test. It was a slow dismantling of your sanity. Fear, silence, and endless cold worked together like a gang of thieves, stripping you of rest, of hope, and sometimes even of the will to keep going. Imagine lying there in the dark. You're half-starved, your fingers ache, your toes are numb, and all you can hear is your own breath crystallizing in the air. Hours stretch into eternities. You can't move much. Moving means losing what little warmth you've trapped, but lying still means listening to your own thoughts. And thoughts, when sharpened by cold and hunger, become cruel company. The first thief was anxiety. Every rustle outside the shelter could be a predator. Every cough from your child could mean illness. Every draft across your skin felt like a warning. Your body never let you rest. It kept you on high alert, filling your blood with panic even when nothing happened. You lived in a state of permanent false alarms. The second thief was despair. Darkness and silence convinced you that the world was shrinking, that tomorrow would be no different from today, and that survival was just postponing the inevitable. Without fire, there was no glow to remind you of life, no flicker to prove that light still existed in the world. You began to feel invisible, erased, like you'd been buried alive under endless night. And then came hallucinations, Exhaustion and cold twisted your senses. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. Whispers filled the silence. Ancestors seemed to crouch in the dark corners of the cave. Maybe that's where gods were born, in freezing minds desperate for meaning. You started to see faces in the flicker of nothing, hear voices in the moan of wind. And once those visions arrived, they didn't leave. Social bonds frayed under the strain. Without firelight to ease conversation, suspicion bloomed. Was your cousin really shifting closer for warmth, or reaching for your pouch of dried meat? Was that mutter a prayer, or a complaint against you? Trust eroded, replaced by quiet paranoia. And paranoia, like cold, spread quickly through a clan. The psychological toll wasn't just nightly, it was cumulative. The weight of fear and despair bent spines and hollowed eyes. People grew short-tempered, withdrawn, bitter. Grief from losing children or elders didn't heal. It layered, night after night, until whole groups walked under invisible burdens. And here's the bitter irony. You couldn't even show weakness. Complaining, crying, or giving in to despair didn't make things better. It made you a liability. Survival demanded silence, stoicism, obedience. So you carried your dread privately, quietly, until it reshaped who you were. That's what the cold did best. It rewrote people. Not just their bodies, but their minds. It taught caution where once there was courage, suspicion where once there was trust, resignation where once there was joy. Without fire, you didn't simply live in darkness, you became it. And still, through all that weight, you kept moving forward. Not because it was easy, but because stopping meant death. Yet there was one more lesson waiting in that black abyss. The cold didn't just separate the weak from the strong. It separated the firekeepers from everyone else. Because evolution didn't care how brave you were, it cared who could keep the flame alive. And here's the cruel punchline to the whole story. The Ice Age didn't just punish individuals. It sifted entire lineages. Sleeping without fire wasn't just miserably, it was evolutionary suicide. Those who couldn't master flame didn't simply suffer. They vanished. Their stories ended in caves no one remembers. Bones gnawed by predators or buried in frost. The cold didn't just kill, it edited. And you, sitting here now, are proof of which side survived. Think about it. Fire was the great divider. The groups that kept it lived longer, raised more children, healed faster, and carried their genes forward. The groups that lost it, well, they became lessons. Evolution doesn't hand out participation trophies. It looks at your frozen body, shrugs, and invests in the people who figured out how to strike sparks and guard embers. With fire, meat became calories instead of jaw exercise. Tubers became food instead of gut torture. Parasites boiled away, infections slowed, warmth returned. Nights weren't just survival, they became opportunities. Around fire, people talked, planned, bonded. They told stories that turned into culture, myths that turned into gods, knowledge that turned into memory. The flame wasn't just survival, it was identity. Without it, you were stuck in the dark, chasing shadows until extinction claimed you. Fireless groups might have lived for a while, clinging to caves and hides, but they were always one long winter away from disappearance. The evolutionary math was brutal. Keep fire, survive. Lose fire, die. Humanity's great leap forward wasn't just hunting or language, it was the ability to control a spark and keep it alive through the night. And the divide wasn't abstract. You could see it in health. Firekeepers grew taller, stronger, healthier. Their bones showed fewer signs of malnutrition. Their children lived longer. Their elders lasted further into age. Fireless groups left skeletons marked by frostbite, stunted growth, and teeth ground down from chewing raw plants. Archaeologists can read those bones like scorecards, and the firekeepers always win. But here's the strange beauty of it. Survival wasn't about heroes. It wasn't about the strongest hunter or the bravest warrior. It was about the one person who remembered to guard the embers, to carry a glowing coal in a bark container from camp to camp, to kneel in the wind blowing patiently at kindling until smoke curled and flame returned. Civilization began not with kings, but with the fire watchers, the ones who refused to let the cold win. So when you curl up tonight under your thick blankets, adjusting the thermostat because the room feels a bit chilly, remember this: you are descended from people who learned the hard way that sleeping without fire was a death sentence. You exist because someone, thousands of years ago, kept the flame alive when the wind wanted it gone, and everyone else, they disappeared into the cold, erased without ceremony. forgotten except for a few bones and the lesson carved into the species: master fire or become history. The story of people sharing warmth with dogs begins not with comfort, but with desperation. Somewhere in the Upper Paleolithic, long before the idea of a pet existed, wolves were circling the edges of human camps, sniffing for scraps. The arrangement wasn't sentimental, it was transactional. People had food, wolves had sharp senses, and both had to survive nights that were a bit harder than teeth. Over time, a few wolves lingered closer, tolerated by people who noticed that proximity didn't always end in blood. They became smaller, less fearful, and slowly turned into companions. The warmth they carried in their bodies became as valuable as their noses or their loyalty. Archaeological traces tell the story in fragments. Graves where humans were buried with canines as early as 14,000 years ago suggest bonds that went beyond convenience. But the truth was simpler than ritual. At night, when fire sputtered or vanished, the heat of another living body made the difference between waking with frostbite or waking at all. These early dogs were not decorative, they were insulation with teeth, and they weren't alone in this role. Humans themselves were heating units, pressing together in shelters, sleeping in clusters that looked less like families and more like piles. Hides provided barriers, caves gave walls, but the real furnace was the collective body. To share warmth was to stay alive, and to stay alive was to pass on stories, skills, and the strange decision to invite wolves into the circle. It wasn't romance, not at first. Dogs weren't cuddled so much as tolerated, allowed to curl at the edges of the sleeping mass because they gave heat and, in return, received scraps. Yet over generations, that tolerance became intimacy. Archaeological digs in Siberia and Germany show dogs buried carefully beside humans, their skeletons positioned as if they once shared not just life, but sleep. And that detailed the placement of bodies suggests something more than utility. It suggests familiarity, trust forged through countless frozen nights when survival depended on contact. The image is easy to imagine: a damp cave, breath misting in the air, a small fire reduced to embers, children pressed between parents, elders wrapped in hides, and dogs curled at the edges like living blankets with eyes that never fully closed. The cold pressed in from every angle, but in the center there was warmth, stitched together from fur, flesh, and fragile alliances. This was the beginning of co-sleeping with dogs not born from tenderness, but from necessity, with fire as an unreliable ally and the night always too long. It was survival by proximity, a pact without words, sealed every evening when the wind howled and bodies drew closer. And once that pattern was set, the act of huddling became more than a choice. It turned into the oldest strategy of all: the deliberate clustering of human bodies, pressed tight against one another, each ribcage, shoulder, and thigh a part of the night's fragile fire. When the wind pushed through cracks in the shelter and the fire shrank to nothing but smoke, huddling became the fallback plan. Human bodies were never designed to sleep alone in the cold. They functioned like radiators only when stacked together. Archaeological remains of Ice Age shelters show circles of bedding material: red mats, grasses, piles of hides that weren't arranged like individual beds, but like nests. People lay shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, sometimes even overlapping, turning themselves into one organism with many beating hearts. The biology behind it was mercilessly practical. A single body radiates heat into the air and loses it instantly. Two bodies pressed together reduce that loss. Three create a pocket of warmth, and by the time a dozen cluster, they form a microclimate, a bubble of survivable air in a cave where the outside world could kill within minutes. Children were wedged into the middle, elders tucked between stronger adults, everyone arranged according to circulation, vulnerability, and necessity. Huddling wasn't silent, though. Imagine the sounds: coughing, snoring, restless shifting, the muffled complaints of bodies pressed too close. Intimacy was replaced by logistics. Proximity wasn't affection, It was This was survival measured in breaths and in degrees, where moving too far from the group could mean waking up with frost frozen in your hair and a body too stiff to rise. The practice isn't gone. Anthropologists studying nomadic groups in Siberia, Mongolia, and the Arctic still find echoes of it. Families sleeping in tight lines, children always in the center, dogs pressed near the entrance to take the edge off drafts. The pattern is consistent because the logic is unshakable. Heat leaves bodies, bodies steal it back from one another. Huddling is the oldest blanket humanity ever made, yet it wasn't without its dangers. The closeness that conserved warmth also spread disease, lice, and every parasite tucked into hair and fur. Still, people accepted the trade-off. Death from infection was slow. Death from cold was immediate. The body became both shield and contagion, necessary and risky. A contradiction endured each night. So the circle of huddling wasn't just practical, it was ritualistic. Sleeping positions mattered. Who was allowed into the warmth mattered. To be excluded was to be sentenced to freeze, and to be welcomed was to be woven into the group's very survival. Each breath of warm air carried meaning, each pressed shoulder an unspoken pact, and at the edges of this human furnace, another participant lingered shaggy, watchful, and just as desperate for heat. Dogs weren't in the center yet, but they were there, curled at the margins, learning the shape of human survival and quietly reshaping it. On the outer ring of that human heap lay the dogs curled, alert, steaming faintly in the cold air. They weren't pampered companions or pets with collars. They were simply warm, breathing bodies with fur thick enough to trap heat and instincts sharp enough to notice danger before people did. Their place in the circle wasn't ceremonial. It was thermodynamic. Early dogs, descended from wolves that had lingered too close to human camps, offered something no hide or pile of straw could replicate: warmth that renewed itself. A dog's resting body temperature hovers just above that of a human, a steady furnace under a layer of fur that could turn an icy night into something survivable. People noticed, and dogs noticed back. The arrangement hardened into habit. Archaeologists find traces of this quiet partnership in burials, humans and dogs laid together, bodies carefully positioned as if death was only an extension of sleep. The evidence doesn't point to luxury. It points to dependence. These animals weren't just guards or hunting partners, they were insulation. Their fur matted into the hides of people who pressed against them through endless winters. Picture it, a low shelter built of bones and skins, the floor lined with stiff grasses. In the center, a cluster of children wedged between adults, and at the edges, 2 or 3 dogs curled nose to tail, fur brushing against human ankles. The sound of their breathing filled the silence, their bodies radiating steady heat into the space. If one shifted away, someone dragged it back closer. Survival blurred the lines between species. The habit persisted across time and geography. Accounts from Arctic peoples centuries later describe sled dogs invited inside during storms, sleeping against their owners, sharing both warmth and fleas. Nomadic herders in Central Asia did the same with their dogs, and sometimes with smaller livestock goats brought into tents at night when the temperature dropped below bearable. What mattered was body heat, not boundaries. The dogs, for their part, adapted beautifully. They grew comfortable near fire, tolerated human restlessness, and learned to settle at the edges of groups where their warmth was needed most. Their watchfulness doubled the bargain, warmth in exchange for vigilance. If predators prowled near, the dogs stirred first, ears pricking before human eyes opened. They became not just living blankets, but living alarms. Of course, intimacy came with a cost. Dogs carried fleas, ticks, and all the parasites that thrived in dense fur. Close contact meant those pests spread through the human cluster, biting through skin already raw from cold. Yet people accepted it, because the alternative was waking stiff and frozen. It was a calculated misery ender, the crawling itch to keep the warmth, and in that way the dogs stopped being outsiders. They were drawn into the nightly architecture of survival, part of the circle, part of the warmth. What had begun as a fragile truce with wolves became the quiet intimacy of sleeping pressed against another species, their heat and yours stitched together against the cold. But warmth wasn't just shared in circles of fur and flesh. It was shaped by the spaces people built, the shelters designed not for comfort, but for keeping the cold at bay. Shelter, in the Ice Age and long after, wasn't about beauty. It was about trapping heat, however little there was. Archaeologists uncover the skeletons of those spaces. Mammoth bones arranged into circles, tusks leaning like ribs, hides stretched taut across them to make walls. Inside, the floor was padded with grasses, reeds, sometimes moss, layered thick to lift bodies off the freezing ground. These weren't homes, they were improvised furnaces, designed to turn breath and body heat into something that lingered. The arrangement inside mattered. Sleeping areas were circles or lines, with children pushed into the middle like precious coals, adults forming a shield around them, and dogs slotted at the perimeter. Entrances were narrow, sometimes sealed with hides at night to cut drafts, forcing everyone to share the same stale air until morning. Claustrophobic, yes, but the stale air was warmer, and warmth was the only currency worth hoarding. Even caves, which seemed like natural shelters, had their flaws. Their stone walls radiated cold and dripped with condensation, turning interiors into damp refrigerators. People learned to build smaller sleeping enclosures inside the vast chambers, lining niches with hides, stacking stones to block gusts, funneling smoke into cracks above. A cave alone was not enough. A cave had to be re-engineered into something that held heat rather than leached it away. Tents and huts, on the other hand, were miracles of pragmatism. In Siberia, remnants of circular dwellings show frames made of wood and bones lashed together, covered in hides that once belonged to mammoths, bison, or reindeer. They weren't spacious, they were deliberately cramped. The tighter the walls, the less air to warm, and the faster the huddled bodies could raise the temperature inside. A dozen people, 2 or 3 dogs, and suddenly the space was 10 degrees warmer than the howling night outside. Not comfort, but survival. And fire, when it was present, didn't always sit in the middle like a romantic hearth. Sometimes the smoke was too choking, and people kept flames small, off to one side, or in a shallow pit. At times, they relied more on the architecture of bodies than on the architecture of flame. And when the fire failed, the architecture remained. The compact hut, the sealed entrance, the tight human knot stitched into its floor. Later traditions carried echoes of this logic. Nomads in Central Asia built felt yurts, layered so thick that breath alone could raise the temperature. Inuit families carved snow houses where the very act of clustering turned ice into insulation. Across continents, the pattern was the same. People shaped space to conserve warmth, and then arranged themselves and their dogs inside it like bricks in a living wall. It was never about comfort. Cramped, smoky, flirridden, damp shelters weren't pleasant. They were survival chambers. Architecture wasn't decoration, it was engineering against extinction. And at night, the design dictated the rhythm of sleep. Who lay at the center, who pressed against the walls, who shared space with the dogs. Because inside those walls, warmth wasn't distributed equally. Age, strength, and status decided who slept where and who froze closer to the edge. The nightly choreography of survival was never random. Where you lay in the pile could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite, belonging and exclusion. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic parallels point to a simple rule. The most vulnerable slept in the middle. Infants and young children were always pressed between adults, cushioned by the heat of stronger bodies. Losing a child to the cold wasn't just grief, was the slow collapse of the group's future. Elders, too, were often drawn inward, though their place was precarious. A grandmother with stiff joints or a grandfather with fading strength offered wisdom, but wisdom didn't warm toes. When resources thinned, their position drifted toward the margins, and sometimes they gave up their place entirely, pushing children closer to the fire of human bodies, while they themselves curled near the draft. Survival carried tenderness, but it also carried brutal arithmetic. Adults filled the structure with their bodies like bricks in a wall. Women carrying infants slept in the warmest core, pressed against other mothers, nursing through the night under hides damp with breath. Men often positioned themselves at the edges, backs against walls or entrances, where cold and predators seeped in first. This wasn't just gallantry, it was strategy. The hunters who risked injury and exhaustion by day were also the sentinels at night, trading sleep for vigilance, warmth for the right to react first. Dogs, meanwhile, became the living insulation at the periphery. Archaeological traces suggest they often curled at the outer ring, sometimes near the feet of sleepers, sometimes close to doorways. Their bodies absorbed drafts, their ears picked up sounds in the dark. In many shelters, They were the first to feel the cold, and the first to wake at danger. A barking dog could jolt an entire cluster into readiness faster than any groggy human watchman. This sleeping order wasn't just a survival instinct, it became a cultural rhythm. Among Inuit families, children slept pressed to their mothers, with dogs wedged near the entrance of snow houses. In nomadic tents of Central Asia, elders and infants occupied the central bedding areas, flanked by adults who shielded them from wind that slipped through seams. The pattern repeats across geography because the logic is universal. Warmth flows inward, cold seeps outward, and survival depends on controlling that flow. But it wasn't only practical. Sleeping order carried meaning. To be allowed in the center was a mark of belonging, trust, and value. To be left on the edge was an unspoken judgment. Less vital, less safe, less necessary. At night, warmth and hierarchy were the same thing. And in that tangle of bodies, sleep became more than rest. It was ritual, a nightly reminder of who mattered most, who guarded the edges, and who risked the cold. And sometimes, warmth itself was wrapped in symbols, turning the act of huddling into something sacred. What began as raw survival slowly thickened into ritual. Sleeping arrangements weren't just practical, they carried symbolic weight, a choreography of warmth that echoed through myth and custom. To press close at night wasn't only to share heat, it was to enter a fragile circle where the living, the dead, and even the animals were bound together under one roof. Dogs especially drifted into the realm of the sacred. In burial sites across Eurasia, their bones lie curled beside human ones, suggesting more than companionship. They weren't only warmth givers, they were mediators, liminal figures who straddled wilderness and hearth. Some groups believed their presence at night kept not only predators away, but spirits too. A dog pressed at the threshold of a shelter wasn't just a guard, it was a spiritual gatekeeper, a reminder that warmth meant protection on both sides of the visible world. Among nomadic groups in colder regions, co-sleeping carried ritualized patterns. Mothers with infants were wrapped together in layers of hide, often given symbolic blessings before long winter nights, as if acknowledging that warmth itself was a fragile covenant. Families sang lullabies not only to soothe children, but to stitch the group into one rhythm, one breath, one collective body against the cold. The act of huddling became a theater of belonging. Anthropologists studying historic Arctic practices describe sleeping piles where placement was not random but ceremonial, reflecting kinship ties and obligations. To be pulled into the center was to be acknowledged as essential. To lie at the margin was sometimes punishment, sometimes a role, sometimes exile. In such arrangements, warmth was social currency, and sleep itself became a kind of ritual affirmation of bonds. Even firelight, when present, was folded into this symbolic architecture. Flames illuminated faces pressed close, casting shadows that turned the huddle into something communal and sacred. Stories told around those flames often centered on animals, wolves, dogs, bears, creatures that crossed between human and non-human worlds. By day, they were dangers or allies. By night, they became companions, literal partners in warmth. The narrative and the act mirrored each other. Dogs especially took on mythic significance. In many traditions, they guarded the boundary between life and death, warmth and cold, inside and outside. Their place in the sleeping circle reinforced that symbolism. The edge dweller, the one who received the draft first, the one who barked at unseen things in the dark. They were more than insulation, they were woven into the spiritual logic of survival. So what began as necessity evolved into nightly ritual. Warmth wasn't only shared, it was sanctified. The act of pressing bodies together became an affirmation of kinship, of faith, of the strange pact between humans and dogs. And this sanctity extended beyond comfort. It worked on the mind as much as the body, quieting fear, shaping trust, and pulling communities together in ways colder logic could never explain. Because the circle of warmth didn't just fight cold, it soothed the mind, dissolving some of the dread of endless night. Shared warmth did more than keep skin from freezing. It softened the sharp edges of fear. In the absence of firelight, the simple weight of another body pressed against yours could be enough to trick the mind into quiet. Anxiety lessened when breath from a sleeping neighbor fogged the air beside you, when the steady heartbeat of a dog at your feet reminded you that something living was awake, alert, and radiating heat. The cold fractured people into shivering individuals. Warmth stitched them back into a group. Psychologists today would call it co-regulation. Back then, it was just survival, with a side effect of trust. Lying alone in a cave meant listening to every creak and rustle as a potential threat. Lying in a mass of bodies muffled that fear. There was safety in numbers, but also in proximity. Closeness produced not just heat, but primal reassurance that the world wasn't empty, that others were enduring the same dark hours beside you. Dogs amplified this effect. Their very presence softened fear, because they embodied vigilance. Even asleep, ears twitched, noses twitched. The promise of alarm curled inside every muscle. Humans could rest more deeply with dogs nearby, not because they imagined companionship in the modern sense, but because instinct said, something else will hear danger before I do. The warmth was physical, but the comfort was psychological layers of trust, knitted into fur and breath. And this nightly intimacy reshaped relationships. Families and groups weren't only bonded through food sharing or rituals around the fire. They were bound by the memory of nights survived shoulder to shoulder, thigh to thigh, with only body heat holding the void at bay. To share warmth was to prove loyalty. To abandon someone to the cold was to declare them expendable. Every morning the arrangement of bodies left unspoken records: who was cherished, who was tolerated, who had been pushed closer to the draft. Sleep then became social currency. Children learned trust in the warmth of their mother's chest. Elders received dignity when granted space in the center. Adults measured intimacy and obligation in the simple act of touching, or not touching, during the long black hours. These gestures had no words, but they shaped bonds as powerfully as myths and hunts. Anthropologists tracing parallels among Arctic groups note the same patterns. Storytelling before sleep, huddling during storms, the slow rise of quiet laughter even in the dark. Sharing warmth wasn't just about calories of heat, it was about dissolving loneliness. In the absence of firelight, people became the fire for one another, their closeness transforming dread into tolerable silence. Dogs, too, carved themselves into this psychological equation. The quiet act of pressing against a human body blurred boundaries. No longer predator, not quite a tool, something liminal, instead comfort wrapped in fur. Guardianship disguised as sleep. Their warmth soothed children, their presence reassured adults, their watchfulness made the night feel less infinite. If fire created community through light, dogs created it through touch, and in that closeness, intimacy grew in ways colder logic can't explain. These weren't romantic gestures or displays of affection as modern eyes would expect. They were survival-born bonds, where warmth itself became the measure of trust, and trust, built in silence, endured into daylight. The group that shared warmth at night hunted better, gathered better, fought less. Proximity forged cooperation, but warmth was never free of trade-offs. Alongside trust and comfort came something less pleasant: fleas, infections that spread quickly in bodies pressed too close. The same circle that soothed the mind also carried invisible costs, which meant survival always balanced on the thin line between intimacy and infestation. The circle of warmth came with an unspoken price. The colder the night, the closer the bodies, and the closer the bodies, the quicker the parasites spread. Lice, fleas, and ticks thrived in exactly the conditions humans created when they sealed themselves into bone huts or caves. Damp, warm pockets of flesh and fur, layered hides that never quite dried, and air thick with breath. Comfort at night doubled as breeding ground. Evidence of this trade-off is literally etched into ancient remains. Lice combs carved from bone have been uncovered across Europe and Asia. Proof that people weren't just itchy, they were innovating ways to scratch the problem out of their hair. Fossilized lice eggs cling to mummified scalps and woven fabrics, silent witnesses to nights spent scratching under hides that reeked of damp dog fur. Fleas, equally opportunistic, hopped from canine to human and back again, their bites leaving behind sores that could fester when left untreated. But fleas and lice weren't the worst of it. Infected wounds became silent killers. Pressing so tightly together meant infections passed quickly, through shared bedding or unhealed cuts, scraped against rough hides. A small scratch could turn into fever, a cough into an epidemic that traveled faster than a hunt. The irony was bitter. The same arrangement that protected against cold also accelerated disease, and yet, the calculus always came out the same. Parasites were miserable, yes, but frostbite was worse. An infection might kill weeks later. The cold could kill before sunrise. People tolerated the crawling itch, the sores, the spreading rashes, because the alternative was waking stiff and blue. Fleas could be endured, freezing could not. Hygiene, in this context, was less about cleanliness and more about damage control. Ash, from fires, when available, was rubbed into hides and skin to smother insects. Bedding was occasionally burned or abandoned entirely when infestations grew too severe. Dogs, too, carried their share of pests, yet they were never excluded from the huddle. Their warmth outweighed their baggage. Better to scratch by day than freeze by night. The psychological toll was considerable. Imagine lying in the dark, already restless with hunger and fear, while feeling the constant crawl of insects in your hair and on your skin. Children cried from bites, elders winced from sores, adults tried not to itch wounds that never healed properly. Sleep was fractured not only by fear of predators, but by the steady torment of pests. The circle that promised safety also delivered irritation in relentless doses. Anthropologists studying later nomadic groups describe this same balance: yurts filled with both warmth and lice, Arctic huts packed with fleas, tent interiors crawling with ticks carried by dogs. None of it was new. These problems stretched back tens of thousands of years, locked into the fabric of shared survival. Every flea bite, every rash, every sleepless night was part of the cost of co-sleeping, and yet the trade was always made. The circle of warmth held, despite its inconveniences. People and dogs endured the crawling itch because the cold outside was worse. And this endurance wasn't just about individuals, it was about groups, clans, even entire populations, because those who learned to tolerate discomfort, who balanced intimacy with infestation, who kept huddling anyway, they're the ones who left descendants. The ones who froze in solitude, keeping clean but cold. Evolution didn't write their names into the next chapter. And so, night after night, humans clung to one another, and to their dogs, scratching as much as shivering, trading hygiene for heat. And slowly, this habit became more than a tactic. It became tradition, carried across continents and centuries, shaping not just survival but culture. The habit of sharing warmth with dogs and with each other didn't vanish when glaciers retreated. It followed people into every climate where night still bit, and it left its fingerprints in cultures scattered across continents. What began in Ice Age caves shows up centuries later in tents, yurts, longhouses, igloo structures that looked different but worked on the same principle. Trap heat, pile bodies, survive the night. In the Arctic, Inuit families pulled sled dogs inside snow houses during storms, the animals curling along walls, adding their heat to the compact space. Elders told stories of children falling asleep with their faces buried in thick fur, both soothed and warmed by the animals that had pulled them across ice that day. In Mongolia and Siberia, nomadic herders slept in yurts lined with sheepskins, their dogs at the entrances. Livestock sometimes pressed into the same space when winds howled across the steppes. Again, the logic was simple. Every living body was a coal, and a pile of coals made a fire. Even in medieval Europe, long after cities began to rise, peasants still kept their dogs in the bed. Not from sentiment, but from necessity. Houses were draughty, winters were cold, and blankets were thin. Historical accounts grumble about fleas and dirt, but they also mention the warmth of a faithful hound pressed against bare feet through the night. The practice wasn't a luxury of poverty, it was continuity, an echo of arrangements as old as domestication itself. Ethnographic studies across Africa and South America show similar traces. Families huddling in huts, dogs tolerated inside, warmth shared in circles. In the Andes, guinea pigs, not dogs, were kept indoors at night, their body heat adding to the thermal mass of a small house. The species shifted, but the principle never did. Humans everywhere treated animals as living heaters, their warmth folded into the architecture of survival. The pattern reveals something striking: the way warmth sharing bound together not just families, but whole communities. Sleeping in clusters was universal, from Siberian tribes to nomadic Bedouins to mountain shepherds. Dogs, goats, sheep, even chickens entered the circle. Warmth erased boundaries of species and status. In the dark, the line between animal and companion blurred into simple arithmetic. More bodies meant more survival. And these practices weren't random, they were passed on, taught, normalized. The decision to let a dog curl against a child at night wasn't accidental. It was tradition reinforced by memory. Last winter we survived because the dog lay close. In that way, the habit became cultural, not just practical. It was woven into myths, into lullabies, into the design of homes. Archaeology backs this continuity. From Paleolithic dog burials in Germany to sled dog remains in Greenland, 2 medieval skeletons found inside houses with human bones. The evidence insists people and dogs shared not only labor and food, but sleep. The warmth-sharing pact carried forward, unbroken, even when technologies changed. But continuity also meant carrying forward the darker side, the crawling pests, the shared diseases, the crowded coughs in the dark. Warmth was survival, yes, but never without cost. And yet, the practice endured, because fire alone was never enough. And in modern times, that endurance lingers still. People tuck small dogs under blankets, cats curl across chests, larger breeds sprawl against feet. The parasites are gone or at least managed, but the instinct remains. What began as Ice Age necessity has become a strangely tender inheritance, a memory written in behavior. But before warmth sharing became the harmless indulgence of modern beds, it carried enormous weight. It wasn't nostalgia, it was the difference between extinction and continuity. And that legacy is why, even now, the practice survives, though its meaning has shifted. Which leaves the final point, how something born in desperation turned into affection, and why co-sleeping with dogs today feels less like survival and more like comfort. The circle of warmth that once meant survival hasn't disappeared. It's simply softened, reshaped into something gentler, almost sentimental. What began as the desperate calculus of Ice Age nights now lingers as ritual, comfort, and perhaps a faint ancestral memory every time a dog curls against a human body under modern sheets. Look closely, and the echoes are obvious. Archaeologists traced dog burials from 14,000 years ago. Their bones nestled carefully beside humans, as if continuing an eternal sleep. Modern households reenact that intimacy nightly, though now the setting is a mattress instead of a mammoth bone hut. People let their dogs sprawl across their legs, pressed against their backs, tucked into crooks of arms, and they call it affection. But the behavior is ancient, warmth sharing, reborn in a world where the cold no longer kills so quickly. The psychological pull hasn't changed either. Studies show that people who sleep with dogs nearby feel calmer, less anxious, more secure. It's the same reassurance our ancestors felt when those first half-tamed wolves shifted at the edge of the sleeping circle, ears pricking at unseen dangers. Only now the threats are smaller, loneliness, silence, the weight of the day pressing down. Still, the warmth of another body dissolves it. The dog's breath against a hand, the steady rhythm of its chest rising and falling, lulls humans into the same uneasy peace it did thousands of years ago. And people still huddle together, though now we call it intimacy rather than survival. Couples curl beneath blankets, families nap in clusters, infants press against mothers in cribs or beds, soothed by warmth and heartbeat. The biology hasn't shifted. Body heat stabilizes, calms, reassures. What has changed is the meaning. No longer desperation, but comfort. No longer a necessity, but a choice. Yet the choice reveals something older. Warmth is memory. It carries the echo of nights in caves when survival depended on whose body you pressed against. The bond with dogs in particular carries that echo most clearly. Their fur, their nearness, their quiet watchfulness. These are inherited roles, repeated every time a dog curls into its human side. They are guardians, heaters, companions, as they have been since before stories had words. Of course, the costs linger too. Fleas, ticks, allergens. The modern version of parasites is less fatal, but no less irritating. Yet even here, the ancient calculation remains. Comfort outweighs inconvenience. People still choose the scratch over the cold, the sneeze over the silence. The contract has held across millennia. So the legacy of warmth sharing today is more than cute habits or sentimental attachment. It's a line that runs straight from Ice Age shelters to suburban bedrooms, from desperate survival to deliberate tenderness. Fire may have changed everything, but dogs and bodies pressed together did too. And that simple act, clustering for warmth, still carries the weight of history in every quiet, half-asleep embrace. The cold carved this legacy, and warmth preserved it. And while the predators and glaciers are gone, the instinct remains, to reach out in the dark, to curl against fur or flesh, and to survive together, one night at a time. The trouble started with the eyes. Human vision was never designed for the night. It belonged to the day, where colors mattered, gestures mattered. The tiny flick of grass revealed a hair, and the faint twitch of muscle gave away an enemy's hesitation. In daylight, the human eye thrived. But once the sun dipped, all that evolutionary brilliance dimmed into near blindness. The rods and cones in the retina worked well enough for distinguishing fruit from foliage, but not for picking out the shape of a crouching predator in the black mouth of a cave. Compared to cats, owls, even rats, people were practically stumbling blind. Darkness made this weakness mercilessly obvious. A lion's reflective eyes caught the faintest glimmer of moonlight. A wolf's nose guided it through pitch black. Humans, by contrast, tripped over roots, cracked their ankles in burrows, and mistook shadows for shapes until panic made the distinction irrelevant. The eye strained, the mind filled the gaps, and suddenly a patch of grass was a stalking hyena, a branch was a spear, and silence was never silenced, was menace. The irony was that human survival relied on awareness, yet awareness collapsed after dusk. Depth perception shrank, distance dissolved, and even inside shelters the world became hostile. The smallest flame of firelight revealed this difference. Just a flicker in the night expanded the range of vision, gave edges back to walls, and drew a fragile line between safety and chaos. Without it, every movement was guesswork. A figure stepping inside the hut might be a returning hunter or not. Eyes couldn't tell. The evolutionary disadvantage went beyond danger. It reshaped behavior itself. Humans adapted by freezing, by avoiding movement, by choosing stillness over the risks of walking blind into branches, pits, or worse. The dark was not empty, it was a shifting blur, one that punished curiosity and rewarded immobility. And it wasn't just clumsiness or fear. Darkness stripped people of their primary sense, forcing reliance on sound and touch, both unreliable substitutes. The rustle of leaves grew into threat, the brush of fur against a leg into imagined claws. Sight had left the scene, and with it went the confidence of daylight. This failure of vision, etched into human biology, was the opening that made night so dangerous. It created vacuum predators filled with ease, and the creatures who slipped easily through the dark became the second torment of night, the ever-watchful, ever-hunting neighbors whose eyes didn't need fire to pierce the void. Darkness didn't arrive alone. It came escorted by eyes that glowed in the blackened paws that padded silently over frozen ground. For predators, night was an open invitation. The cover of shadow, the element of surprise, the world tilted perfectly in their favor. Lions on the savannah, wolves on the steppes, hyenas in their scavenger. Parades, all of them, operated with a grace humans couldn't match. What was blindness to one species was opportunity to another. Big cats had eyes tuned like instruments, reflecting even the weakest flicker of moonlight, turning a starlit field into a hunting ground. A single crouch in the grass went unnoticed by human vision, but not by their own. Wolves and wild dogs used night to test the edges of camps, sniffing out scraps of meat, listening for weakness. Hyenas with jaws designed to turn bone into powder patrolled the perimeters like shadows with teeth. Archaeological evidence whispers the same story. Bones gnawed in the night, shelters breached, camps abandoned in haste. Predation didn't happen only when people strayed too far. It happened when fire dimmed, when the group drifted into uneasy sleep, when vigilance faltered for an hour too long. Darkness wasn't just a backdrop, it was the predator's camouflage. And humans, stripped of vision, stood out like prey waiting to be tested. And it wasn't only the big threats. Snakes, scorpions, insects all took advantage of invisibility. A barefoot step in the dark could mean venom rising through veins before dawn. Darkness lowered defenses, and every creature that had evolved to thrive in it pressed their advantage. The nightly anxiety carved itself into memory. Myths from every continent described creatures of the dark, night demons, shapeshifters, glowing-eyed hunters sent by spirits. The stories weren't exaggerations but reflections of lived terror attempts to explain why a child vanished, why blood streaked the ground, why silence ended in screams. Predators didn't invent fear, they merely confirmed it. This was why the presence of dogs became so vital. Their hearing, their noses, their sudden barks broke the imbalance, giving warning where human eyes failed. A growl at the edge of the camp was often the only defense before claws and teeth breached the dark. Dogs weren't yet companions in the modern sense, they were security systems with fur. So the night became a battlefield of senses, predators armed with sight and stealth, humans huddled with fire and borrowed vigilance, and when the predators didn't strike, the darkness itself still took its toll, unraveling orientation, stripping confidence, making every step feel like a gamble. Because in the dark, the world didn't just hold predators, it erased the very map beneath human feet. Once the sun vanished, the world itself seemed to unravel. Familiar paths dissolved, landmarks flattened into shadows, and the ground became treacherous underfoot. A man who knew every curve of a valley by day could stumble blindly into a ravine by night. A child who wandered 3 steps too far from the fire might never find the way back. Darkness collapsed orientation so completely that even the most ordinary landscape turned into a labyrinth of hazards. The problem wasn't imagination, it was geometry. Without light, depth perception faltered, distances shrank, and edges disappeared. A slope became a pit, a stream became a void, a tree trunk became a lurking figure. Archaeological evidence of broken bones in early human remains hints at how often night punished missteps. Falls, twisted ankles, fractured wrists, injuries that by day could be avoided became inevitable when the ground itself vanished. Inside shelters, the danger persisted. A cave could be vast, echoing, full of cracks and drops. Families crowded into niches, but one wrong step in the dark could mean tumbling into unseen holes. Even bone-framed huts carried risks. Stumble against a tusk, fall across a sharpened flint, crush a sleeping child. Night turned safe spaces hostile, the familiar rearranged into chaos, and when orientation failed, fear filled the gap. The mind compensated for what the eyes couldn't see by imagining threats. The rustle of grass became a predator circling. The creak of wood became footsteps. Silence itself became unbearable, a void where the unknown prowled. Fear didn't just exaggerate dangers, it multiplied them, making every shadow feel like a waiting trap. Some cultures developed rituals to combat this collapse. Songs, chants, or the steady rhythm of spoken stories helped anchor people in place, creating invisible walls of sound where vision failed. Anthropologists studying nomadic groups note how night was often filled not with silence, but with hums, claps, or murmurs, attempting to map the darkness with noise. These weren't casual habits, they were survival strategies. The disorientation of darkness did more than shape behavior, demanded solutions, and none was more revolutionary than fire. Its glow restored edges to the world, redrew boundaries, and gave back the lines that vanished with the sun. The firelight didn't just warm, it created a fragile map of safety, a small island of orientation in a sea of black. But when the fire failed, that island sank. Darkness crept back in, erasing boundaries, dissolving space, and with it came the return of its greatest cruelty, the absence of limits, the absence of protection, the absence of a border between humans and everything else. Fire wasn't only heat, it was a fence. A circle of flame pushed back the dark, creating a border where the world briefly made sense. Step inside that glow, and faces reappeared, gestures returned, even the ground regained its edges. Step outside of it, and everything vanished into blackness again. Archaeologists uncover rings of charcoal at ancient campsites, mute evidence of how central this fragile boundary was, not a luxury, but the only thing separating a cluster of humans from a wilderness with teeth. Without firelight, there was no perimeter. Darkness flowed into the shelter like water, seeping into every corner, erasing where the camp ended and the wild began. The line that fire drew between inside and outside, between safety and exposure, collapsed instantly when flames died. Suddenly, the people lying close together weren't inside anything. They were adrift, unmoored, lying in the same void that predators prowled. The absence of this border invited intrusion. Wolves could test the edge of the camp without being seen. Hyenas could creep closer. Snakes could slide in unnoticed. Even insects swarmed with impunity when fire wasn't there to smoke them back. And for humans, the psychological weight was just as heavy. Without a visible barrier, fear had no limit. The mind expanded dangers to fill the space that fire once contained. This explains why so much ritual and labor went into keeping flames alive. Embers were carried in bark containers between camps, sparks blown into dry grass with patience, fire pits shielded with stones. To lose fire at night wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a collapse of order. It meant lying exposed, without boundary, the body shivering in the cold, while the imagination tore through every possible danger beyond the walls. The absence of light didn't just blur space, it blurred roles. Watchers couldn't guard, parents couldn't soothe their children with the assurance of safety. Darkness made everyone equal in helplessness, stripping away hierarchy as effectively as it stripped away vision. But the most insidious effect wasn't physical at all, it was emotional. The absence of firelight magnified fear into something ancestral, a dread that seemed stitched into the nervous system itself. And that dread, rooted in biology, became its own form of survival, one that shaped a human relationship with night itself. Fear of the dark wasn't superstition, it was training, hardwired, rehearsed, and perfected over millennia. The human nervous system treats darkness not as an absence, but as a presence, a silent threat that demands vigilance. Night anxiety, racing hearts, shivers that have nothing to do with cold. These weren't weaknesses. They were survival alarms, passed forward through generations that managed to outlast the shadows. Neurologists can trace it. The way the amygdala fires more readily when light vanishes. The way cortisol spikes, keeping bodies tense and alert. Children cry louder in the dark. Adults toss and turn more restlessly, and groups cling tighter when fire flickers out. These are not quirks, they are echoes of nights when fear meant the difference between waking and being carried off by claws. The phobia of darkness that still lingers in bedrooms today is the ghost of predators past. Evolution rewarded the cautious. The hunter, who shrugged at rustles in the night, often didn't survive to pass on his genes. The one who trembled, who froze, who imagined the worst, he lasted longer, even if his imagination conjured more threats than reality provided. Fear of the dark exaggerated dangers, but in exaggeration came safety. A body that startled at shadows was a body less likely to be caught. This adaptation shaped behavior in groups. People sang, chanted, or told stories, not simply for entertainment, but to keep the fear in check, to transform the invisible into something communal. A trembling child pressed into the middle of a huddle didn't just benefit from warmth, he learned the rhythm of vigilance, carried forward in whispers and lullabies designed to tame dread without extinguishing it. Fear was allowed to exist, but it was domesticated, turned into ritual. The irony, of course, is that this fear didn't vanish with predators. Even in modern rooms sealed against danger, the unease remains. A creak in the hallway, the absence of light under a door. The sensation of being watched, all of it, is the residue of nights spent in caves with no fire, when the dark was never empty. And that residue did more than keep eyes wide open. It sharpened the other senses, forcing humans to hear more keenly, to invent ways of filling the void where sight had failed. In darkness, sound swelled to fill the gap, and with it came a new set of terrors. When vision collapsed, hearing took the throne. Every rustle, crack, or whisper grew louder in the absence of light. Darkness stretched sound, gave it weight, made it linger longer than it should. A twig snapping in the forest by day was nothing. At night, it was a death sentence rehearsed in the imagination before anything even moved. The ear, unchallenged by sight, turned jumpy. The wind through grass became footsteps. A shifting hide in the shelter became someone or something crawling closer. Even silence betrayed, magnifying the beat of one's own pulse. The hiss of breath, the shuffle of neighbors pressed too tight together. Anthropologists note that many groups filled this void with deliberate sound songs, humming, clapping, anything to overwrite the random noises that otherwise became unbearable. Predators knew this imbalance. A wolf's low growl in the dark didn't need to be close to terrify. It only needed to ride on the imagination. Hyenas laughing outside a camp could freeze a group stiff with fear. No claws required. Sound became theater, and humans were the most captive of audiences. The night itself was a stage, and every crack of branch or howl beyond the fire was a performance with stakes as high as survival. Inside shelters, the same logic applied. Families coughed, muttered, shifted in sleep, and each noise drew questions. Was that breathing or choking? Was that snore human or animal? With vision gone, suspicion spread easily. The ordinary became sinister, and the sinister became unbearable. To cope, cultures invented rituals of sound, night songs, lullabies, chance ways of occupying the air so that noises belonged to the group, rather than to whatever prowled outside. Sound became not only defense but identity, a declaration: we are here, we are many, and we are awake. The rhythms steadied nerves, transformed the unknown into something patterned. But when voices stopped, the dark returned to its old tricks. Every branch became a hunter's step, every breath a ghost, every silence a trap waiting to snap shut. Without light, sound became the ruler of night. And with sound came stories, explanations for the noises no one could identify. Myths born in the spaces where echoes replaced certainty. Because in the end, it wasn't only predators people feared. It was what they imagined filled the dark when nothing else could be seen. Darkness wasn't only a physical condition, it was a canvas. When sight failed and sound lied, the mind painted in the blanks, and what it painted became myth. Across continents, stories sprouted from the same soil of fear. Spirits who slipped out only at night. Creatures that hunted not just bodies but souls. Invisible forces that prowled in the black where even fire refused to reach. Archaeologists and folklorists trace the echoes. In Africa, beings with glowing eyes roamed the night, half animal, half human, blurring predator and ghost. In northern Europe, the wilderness swarmed with spirits of the dark forest, whispering in the silence. In the Americas, night carried shapeshifters, owls that embodied death, and tricksters who thrived on human unease. These weren't inventions of idle minds, they were explanations for the rustle that couldn't be named, the cry that vanished into silence, the child who didn't return by dawn. Darkness equaled chaos. If day was order, night was the collapse of order, the undoing of boundaries between the living and the dead, the human and the animal. Myths grew to restore a kind of meaning. You are not blind, you are being watched. Better a demon you could name than the formless void pressing in from all sides. The presence of dogs in this landscape took on symbolic weight. Their ability to bark at what humans couldn't see cast them as guardians, not only against wolves and hyenas, but against spirits themselves. A dog's growl became reassurance. Something was out there, but at least it could be named. Even today, folklore is heavy with dogs at thresholds, dogs guiding the dead, dogs keeping company in the liminal space between safety and the unknown. That role was forged in darkness, when their bodies pressed against humans for warmth while their ears strained toward what prowled just beyond the circle. The myths shaped behavior. Families chanted before sleep, whispered protective words over children, placed charms or symbols at cave entrances. Every ritual was an attempt to domesticate the dark, to make it a space that could be endured. And still, the dread never left. The stories reassured and terrified in equal measure, ensuring that no one forgot the lesson. Night is not yours. But if myths gave shape to fear, they didn't dissolve the practical truth of darkness. It still froze activity, still forced groups into immobility. The cost of venturing outside after dusk was too high, and so whole societies learned to compress their world into daylight, leaving night as a territory of silence, sleep, and waiting. Darkness didn't just frighten, it froze whole communities in place. Once the last flame sputtered low, activity narrowed to a single option: stay still. Hunting ceased, gathering ceased. Even moving between shelters was too risky. The world outside became an unwalkable void. So groups learned to compress their lives into daylight, cramming labor, ritual, and conflict into the hours when sight returned, and surrendering the night to paralysis. Anthropologists note that this immobility shaped social rhythms. At dusk, people drew close, bodies pressed together under hides or within huts, and the camp shrank into itself. The cold and dark demanded a kind of forced intimacy. Children tucked between parents, elders pressed near the warmth of the center, dogs and sometimes livestock admitted inside. Night was not for individuality, was for clustering, for accepting the rules of proximity. With movement restricted, time itself stretched differently. The hours of darkness lengthened into spaces where little could be done but whisper, breathe, or dream. Archaeological evidence suggests storytelling thrived here. Words filled the void left by work, myths repeated in the dark until they became more real than the faces of predators outside. This nightly pause cemented memory, culture, and the invisible threads of kinship. Immobility also shaped authority. Whoever controlled the fire, whoever guarded the entrance, whoever decided the sleeping order, held power in the dark. Social hierarchies became tangible in night silence, measured not in wealth but in warmth and placement. To be at the center of the huddle was privilege. To be pushed to the draft was punishment, or was ostracism disguised as practicality. But the stillness had costs. With activity suspended, productivity dipped. Nights meant no foraging, no hunting, no building. Entire economies shrank around this simple biological fact. Without light, humans stopped. Other creatures thrived while people endured, waiting for dawn to return. And the consequences weren't just logistical. Darkness magnified vulnerability. If a child cried, if someone fell ill, there was little to be done until the sun returned. Whole nights passed in anxious watching, helplessness stitched into every silence. Night immobilized bodies, and in doing so, reminded everyone how fragile survival was. Yet within this paralysis, bonds deepened. Co-sleeping forged intimacy, trust, and the habit of enduring together. The stillness became a kind of glue, holding groups close. But it was also dangerous because immobility meant reliance, and reliance meant vulnerability, especially for the smallest and weakest huddled in the center. The night's grip fell heaviest on children, those least equipped to survive its dangers alone. Night sharpened the fragility of children more than anyone else. In daylight, they could be watched, taught, or corrected. In darkness, they became small, blind targets for dangers both real and imagined. Their bodies lost heat fastest, their cries carried loudest, and their curiosity the same instinct that made them learners turned deadly when shadows erased the edges of the world. Archaeological burials revealed this reality with quiet cruelty. Graves filled with tiny bones are far more common than adult ones, a reminder that the young rarely survive long enough to leave behind much more than grief. Some of these deaths were seasonal, tied to hunger and illness, but many were circumstantial. A child wandering too far from the huddle, or one smothered under the weight of bodies pressing too close in the night. Darkness was not just absence of light, it was a hazard that thinned the ranks of the next generation. Communities adapted with precision. Children were placed in the safest zones of the sleeping circle, usually between parents, wrapped tightly in hides that trapped warmth. Mothers often kept infants at the breast through the night, not simply for feeding but for heat. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers in harsh climates note the same arrangement. The youngest are always in the middle, guarded on every side. The architecture of the huddle was, in many ways, designed for them. But protection didn't erase vulnerability. Illness struck harder in the dark, when cold air and damp bedding weakened fragile lungs. A child's cough in the middle of the night was more than an annoyance, it was an omen. Families listened closely, powerless to intervene until dawn brought firewood, herbs, or the ability to move safely outside. Silence was the preferred sound. A wailing child risked drawing predators closer, so sometimes lullabies were as much about survival as comfort, pressing noise into patterns that soothed rather than exposed. The myths of many cultures reflect this acute danger. Night spirits were often said to target children first, owls that carried them away, demons that snatched them from beds, shadows that slipped between cracks in the hut. These stories were not exaggerations, they were survival instructions. Keep the child close, keep the child warm, keep the child silent. Yet children were also the most powerful reason for enduring night. The effort to keep them alive bound groups together, turning survival into something more than self-interest. Entire communities organized their spaces, rituals, and nightly routines around protecting the youngest. Their vulnerability was both a danger and a catalyst, forcing adults to invent strategies that strengthened the whole. Still, no amount of ritual or huddling could erase the fact that darkness always had the upper hand. The fragility of children underscored a universal truth. Humans were not made for night, which is why the obsession with creating light, however fragile, became one of the defining features of the species. The struggle against darkness didn't end with huddles, lullabies, or borrowed dog warmth. It fueled an obsession to capture light, to bind it, to carry it into places the sun refused to touch. From the first sparks struck between stones to the careful nursing of embers in bark containers, humans learned to wage war against night with flame. And every advancement in firemaking wasn't just a technical leap, was an act of rebellion against a universe that seemed designed to erase them after dusk. Archaeological sites tell the story in ashes and charcoal layers mark caves where fire burned continuously, evidence of groups willing to devote constant labor just to keep flame alive. Torches made from resin-soaked sticks extended that fragile border of vision, pushing back shadows inside caverns where entire communities once gathered. Lamps carved from stone, filled with animal fat, represent one of humanity's earliest tools of defiance. A portable sun, crude but revolutionary. The pursuit of light reshaped social life. With fire burning, night became usable. People could sit awake longer, share food, plan hunts, whisper stories. Myths themselves deepened in the glow of flame, where flickering shadows gave spirits faces and gods gestures. Fire didn't just keep predators at bay, it stretched the day, creating more hours for culture, for imagination, for weaving memory into narrative. The evolutionary drive toward artificial light reveals how intolerable darkness truly was. Other animals adapted to it. Cats, owls, bats turned night into their element. Humans, by contrast, refused. The brain demanded boundaries, demanded vision, demanded that predators be revealed rather than imagined. Fear of the dark wasn't overcome. It was outsourced, managed through flames, torches, lamps, and eventually the tame brilliance of bulbs and screens. Even now, the pattern lingers. Cities blaze through the night, as if daylight should never end. Bedrooms glow faintly with lamps. Streetlights keep shadows at bay. Night shifts turn midnight into noon. The same fear that once froze groups into silence still hums in the background, hidden beneath convenience. Darkness remains the old enemy, and the instinct to fight it shapes landscapes, economies, and rituals of modern life. The irony is that this victory over darkness didn't erase it entirely. It just pushed it back, layer by layer, into the edges. The forests beyond the suburbs, the unlit corners of rooms, the moments when the power goes out and the old panic returns. For all the light humanity has summoned, the memory of those nights without fire remains etched in the nervous system. A reminder that every spark is borrowed, every bulb is temporary, and the dark is always waiting for its turn.